Two people.
All right. Good morning. Let's get started for today. Welcome back. I hope that the week is going well for you so far. Just as a brief reminder, we'll be talking today and Friday about culture. Monday is an optional attendance midterm review day where we'll be going over the content and things that you need to know to prepare for the exam. And then next Wednesday and Friday, we will not be meeting in class, but that is when the midterm review or the midterm window will open for you to take it on Canvas. Open note, open book. So do look forward to that. I'm going to be starting out class today in a slightly different way. You should have received an announcement right before class if you have a device with you, like laptop, tablet, or phone. If you do not have a device with you today, that is okay. I'll be asking you to work on this through hand. So one thing that I really like to do now that we're about 4 or so weeks into the term, you've had the chance to take a few class meetings with me, is to get a sense of how things are going for you in the class, things that are working well, things that you'd like to see a little bit different, right? Some of the big things, like doing a midterm, of course, are things that we can't necessarily change, but I do like to know within classes, things that are going well that we can continue to do, and things that I can adjust and modify a little bit to help you to make this experience as positive as possible. At the end of the term, you will be turning in an evaluation of the course and how the course has gone for you, right? But that's not really that useful to you because the course is done by that point. So I do like to take inventory earlier in the term to get a sense of things that I can change and adjust for you to help with your experience. So if you have a device with you, if you check on the front page of Canvas, there is an online form that you can do to complete this so that it's pretty fast and efficient. It was sent through Canvas announcement. It's also available right here through the course feedback form. Just asks you to rank and scale some of these things here and include some notes right here about things that are going well and things that you'd like to see adjusted or done a little bit differently. If you don't have a device with you, that's completely okay. You can do this on a sheet of paper, but I ask that you do not write your name down and just keep that anonymous, just to answer these questions. So I'll leave this up for people who want to do this by hand. Otherwise, you're welcome to do that on your device. I'll give people some time to work through that. And then once we've done that, we'll get rolling on talking about the new stuff for today. Many folks would like some more time in working through this. So I really appreciate you taking the time to work through this. This is super helpful. And again, I take that really seriously. What I'll be doing after class today is going through, looking through some of the comments, and then I'll update you about any changes or updates that are happening with the course and things that I'll continue to do based on that. So I do really appreciate you working through that and giving me a sense of how things are going. So thank you. I also have a practice question that we'll talk about that connects to some of the things that we talked about on Monday. So Roger is concerned about whether or not he's a good member of his D&D guild. Which factor of collective self-esteem would best describe his concerns? So the key here is him trying to figure out if he's a good member, right? Maybe he's a mage that heals everybody. Maybe he's a sword fighter who's really good at fighting against dragons, right? Would this be considered private collective, membership, public collective, or importance to identity? Take a little bit of time to think about this, and then we'll talk about it together. Anybody like some more time on this one? So let's talk about this. So last class, we were talking a little bit about culture and the idea that we can define culture across different measurements, including what we see as our self-esteem related to being a part of the group. So how many people think the best answer here is A, private collective, B, membership, C, public collective, or D, importance to identity? Yes, so the best answer here is membership. We use the example talking about something like a sports team. I know a couple of you shared that example for your cultures as well on Monday, right? Private collective is whether or not you think this is a good group, right? Membership esteem is the best answer here because you are trying to weigh how you feel within that group. Am I, healing the party? Am I doing a good job as a part of this group? Public collective would be trying to consider what an outside member would think when they thought about your group, right? So if you've seen the latest season of Stranger Things, right, there's the Hellfire Club that plays D&D. A lot of people at the school think they're a whole bunch of nerds, but people within the club, right, are trying to create positions of leadership among the main cast as a part of that group. And then importance to identity. Is that important or central to who you are, right? Or is this just something that you don't take seriously? So all good things to know as you're thinking about culture and about how we communicate across cultures. So if you were not here on Monday, we spent some time talking a little bit about the Canvas prompts and some of the feedback on those. Just know to continue working through them and let me know if you need any additional support on those. This week's is getting at elements of culture, including defining culture and some of the spectrums of culture that we'll be talking about today, as well as the idea of face work that we'll be looking at today as well. For today, we'll be looking at these measures of culture and some of the ways that we can be effective intercultural communicators. So let's get rolling. One idea here that I think is useful to think about as well when we're engaging with cultures is to think about the challenges of understanding the experiences of different cultural attitudes, right? On a positive end, being sensitive to the needs of members of another culture means that perhaps we're modifying our communication or understanding that maybe what works for us is not what works for members of another group. So for instance, being open or receptive to the ways that people use verbal and nonverbal feedback differently, I think can be an important way that we factor in culture in our communication. However, right, stereotypes are things that develop in a way that hampers our relationships with other people and our ability to communicate effectively across different cultures. Stereotypes are felt at both a cultural and personal level, right? At a cultural level, we can leverage a stereotype against a group of people, for instance, based on things such as ethnicity, race, religion, and so on, which of course we know can be damaging to members of that group because a stereotype is rushing to a judgment about a group without really understanding the individual members and the ways in which members of that group actually behave. But stereotypes can also be made personally as well, right? So we can stereotype a group, but we also stereotype an individual, right? As a member of a group, or we look at attributes of that person and make assumptions about who they are, right? So of course, that baggage of bringing in stereotypes to our interactions can be an incredibly negative one. Oftentimes, we're not able to communicate effectively if that is being used to shortcut our relationships. One example here are the use of things such as names that might connect to things like gender and race. There was a study that found that there's an independent evaluation of people who had submitted resumes for a job, right? And the committees, all else equal, would make stereotypical assumptions about the applicants based on the gender or race that they assumed from that applicant's name, with no other differences. So there are studies to indicate that the use of stereotypes can lead to things like more negative evaluation of a job application. So pushing back against those stereotypes and recognizing that stereotypes, regardless of culture, can be a negative thing is important. Of course, we see stereotypes in the context of gender as well, right? Sort of the ways in which masculinity or femininity might be defined between cultures can vary, of course. So depending on the group that you're a part of, right, the way that performances, behavior, strategies, labor differ depending on gender are important considerations as well. So that can be a way in which people feel reduced into categories or behaviors. There's also this idea of ethnocentrism, which I want to hit on a little bit more because I think this is an important element of thinking about culture in ways that we can move against some of the challenges of the baggage we bring into understanding other cultures. So I like this visual here. It's an elephant who is painting, right? But you can probably imagine this elephant has the trunk and the tusk right in the front. And as a result of that, you can imagine that it sees this tusk every time it's walking around, right? Or if you watched Rugrats, there's the dog, and the dog see its snout every time it's going around and seeing what's going on, right? So that's a challenge of ethnocentrism, right? The hard time seeing past your nose. So ethnocentrism is the idea that an individual might view the world from their cultural perspective, which is not a bad thing, right? We all come in with our own pair of glasses. If we think back to Monday, right, the story of the elephant in the cave, we're all feeling a different part of the elephant and understanding that different part, right? That's not a bad thing. But evaluating other cultures according to our own culture's preconceptions, that is judging other cultures by our own experiences, that can sometimes be a challenge, right? If we were to visit a foreign country that does not speak English as a first language, and we demanded that members of that group speak English to us, right? We wouldn't feel, members of that culture would probably feel pretty disrespected by that. That if you're visiting a country that primarily speaks a language that you don't speak, oftentimes you'll take some efforts to try to learn some basic elements of that language, right? It also comes with a feeling of dislike, mistrust, or hatred for cultures that we could consider to be inferior or worse than us under the idea of ethnocentrism, right? So the idea here is that just because a culture is different or has a different set of beliefs than what we've become used to, right, that doesn't mean that that culture is necessarily worse than ours, right? So oftentimes as humans, we are drawn to what's familiar, what's predictable, what makes sense to us, right? So oftentimes when we apply that in understanding other cultures, those preconceptions can develop into judgments about other cultures and how members of that culture experience the world, right? The idea here is that by learning how other cultures have created stories, have created beliefs and norms that dictate their approach to the world, that is additive to our human experience and understanding of difference. Culture provides us with a vocabulary of understanding and engaging with a multitude of differences. And again, as I brought up on Monday, being able to understand and engage with people across different cultures is something that employers are looking for too. It's considered to be one of the top skills of an effective workforce, is being able to support and engage with members of different groups. So ethnocentrism and stereotypes are oftentimes things that we do without thinking, right? So if we were to see somebody's name, right, we might make assumptions about their race, their gender, their background, etc., that might turn out to be incorrect. So in addition to thinking about these elements of culture, there is a famous cultural scholar known as Stuart Hall. Stuart Hall was essentially the person who was able to develop the idea that there are ways that we can measure and understand cultures and compare cultures to each other, right? Not in a better or worse way, but to understand that there are different things that different cultures do and different ways that cultures communicate. And by contrasting those approaches, we can build good skills in engaging with members of different cultures. So you do not need to write down or know this entire table. This table, I think, is a good way of trying to understand elements of context across cultures. So what we can think about here is the difference between a low context culture and a high context culture. So when we think about context, context matters, right? Context would refer to the presence of things with nonverbal communication. It's the way that there are subtleties and dynamics of the communication situation that shape the way that we talk to each other, right? If you're talking to a friend about studying for a test, and you know that that friend is on the verge of losing their scholarship and they're incredibly anxious and they're pulling an all-nighter, right? That context matters in how you might support that friend. So context is shaping the way that we communicate. In a low context culture, right, the communication that we do with that person does not really include much in terms of subtleties or detail. In other words, a low context culture is one in which communication is very explicit. There is an emphasis on verbal communication, and the communication is generally considered to be a lot more direct, right? You say what you mean in a low context culture. There's not a lot that's left unsaid. If we think about nonverbal communication from last week, right? Nonverbal communication is less present or has less of an impact. I'll give you one example. In Japan, it's very common if you are asked to do something or asked a question, it is generally seen as disrespectful to directly say no to a question. So if you don't want to do something, like you don't want to do your chores, right? Rather than saying no, it's more common for you to say maybe or to say yes, but to do so in a hesitant tone of voice and often by looking to the side, right? That's a cultural norm in which the use of context is important to understanding the message, because while you're saying yes, right, it's a higher context culture in which the tone and nonverbal cues are communicating something very different. Whereas in the United States, if you don't want to do your chores, you're much more likely to say no, no, thank you, I'm not interested. So that would be an element of context shaping our communication. We'll be talking about some of these elements in more detail here, but the idea of cultural orientation is an important element too. If low context culture means that our communication is a lot more direct and a lot more straightforward, right? Generally speaking, we're expressing our emotions less through the use of nonverbal communication. We generally are focused more on the future. What time would you like to get lunch tomorrow? Maybe at noon, right? And there's generally a focus on independence in our communication, right? You say what you mean. Culture is not as present in the interaction to try to modulate what it is being said. And then oftentimes, if we see this in a business or work context, in a lower context culture, right, we have more direct emails. Sometimes we have coworkers who reply all to those emails, but we have much more direct communication that is, again, really trying to say what you mean. Whereas in a higher context culture, there is a much greater emphasis on the use of implicit, right, implied communication. So rather than saying, hey, can you do your chores? Members might point to or even say something about, wow, I noticed that the floor is starting to get dirty, right? So there might be a greater emphasis on kind of passive aggressive styles of communication. But an idea that perhaps we are more polite as a result of being less direct, right? So oftentimes, in terms of social roles and cultural orientation, there's a greater emphasis on the norms and practices of that culture, right? That there is a greater emphasis on how emotion is conveyed using things such as tone of voice, facial expressions. And oftentimes, in a work context, the use of context means that communication is generally focused on trying to cooperate and recognize that one size doesn't necessarily fit all when we're choosing to communicate. So high and low context, right, is not a better or worse. It just means that the implied and unstated parts of your communication tend to be a much bigger deal in a higher context, and the communication tends to be a lot more direct in lower context. To give you another visual here, there is a spectrum of different countries, right? So we can think about countries, if we think about that broad definition of culture, right? A lot of countries fit under those, but we also know that many countries have co-cultures, right? Or smaller groups that exist within that larger culture. So for instance, my communication social change class, we're talking about Puerto Ricans in East Harlem in Manhattan, right? So we're looking at a smaller co-culture or group that exists within a larger culture that might be connected through something like nationality. So over here on this side, a lot of European countries and the United States is on the lower context side, right? These are countries where the language is a lot more direct. People are perhaps more confrontational, right? A lot of stereotypes in countries such as Germany are that people are perhaps a bit rude in the directness of their communication, but that's just what they do. And then on the other end, we have countries like Brazil, UAE, and Japan that are much more focused on those smaller, unstated parts of communication. And there are some practical reasons for this too. In a lot of these higher context cultures, they have much higher population density. So the ability to communicate directly, verbally to everybody is a lot harder. So if you're in a very busy elevator, a lot of the norms and facial expressions are going to be things that make the communication between those groups a lot easier. There are also, these countries tend to be more collectivist, right? And are more focused on the group achievement and group success over individual success, meaning that communication is a lot more focused on supporting and meeting the needs of a broader group. So that spectrum, I think, can be understood in that area as well. So Dr. Selting Toomey brought forward this idea of face negotiation theory. So face negotiation theory, I think, is a useful way to help us understand how we as members of a culture or group are engaging with other cultures. So face negotiation theory is relevant to every culture, but it's especially important when you find yourself in a higher context culture in which those subtleties and details of your communication are especially important, and there might be greater emphasis on things like relational engagement. So let's take the example we brought up on Monday, right? In the country of South Korea, it's generally considered customary that elders will start to kneel and eat first before other members of the group. So what happens if you don't do that, right? Maybe you're an outsider and you eat first and you don't realize that custom or tradition. Or, maybe you're a kid and you're really hungry and you realize that breaking that cultural tradition has a major impact on the group and that it might damage your relationship with your grandfather. So face negotiation theory refers to the ways in which we use communication to navigate and maintain our reputations with other people, right? If you think about face, and you've heard the phrase, right, called saving face. Saving face refers to the idea that we're managing our reputation, negotiating our reputation as it relates to our social relationships. How many people watch Bridgerton? A couple people, maybe a couple people who don't want to admit it, right? I binge watched it for fun. A lot of these like stuffy British period piece type shows, right? There is such an emphasis on face, that is the reputation or well-being of the family and how the family is regarded within society, right? Are you marrying into somebody of nobility or of social status that is relevant to you? That's also connected to this idea of face, that how we appear, what our reputation looks like to other people, how other people regard us, that's something that we have to negotiate and manage over time. And Ting Toomey argues that we use face work when we're put into situations in which our reputation is on the line. So as an example, maybe you are about to interview for a really exciting internship and you're really interested in this chemical engineering internship, right? You do face work to come across as qualified, as interested, as enthusiastic, right? You are creating a positive perception with other people. Or perhaps you're in a situation where you committed a faux pas in that culture. Maybe you ate first at the dinner table, right? You're trying to negotiate and manage respect, to apologize and ensure that your relationship is improved. There was a 2004 film that is called Saving Face that is about a mother-daughter relationship, right? And it's about the role that culture plays in that relationship, right? So the mother is expecting another child and feels very anxious about disclosing and sharing what she feels like is not appropriate for her and her life experience. And the daughter, right, is queer and is interested in negotiating her relationship with her mother with that disclosure too, right? So there's a challenge on both sides and how they maintain their culture, their respect, but also trying to share details about their lives that they worry the other person isn't going to accept. So I wanted to share a trailer from this movie that I think does a good job of thinking about face work and thinking about how members of cultures might consider the role of reputation and managing reputation in relationships.
I was 8 when 4 boys were trying to beat the heck out of him.
Leo has a surprise for her mother.
Remember that? Did she mean that? No, she thinks we conjugate Latin verbs.
Her mother.
So we don't really have to go off.
He is not listening.
Well, why don't you just tell
Shadow.
her? You got to set you up with guy.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Because she has a surprise.
What? Where? What?
Up and running.
Baby. She wants to say, thanks, you. You don't know my mom. Exactly. 你有没有男朋友? Do you know what kind of karmic hell I have to pay as a Chinese daughter than taking her own mom? Now you're wrong. But that Mr. Park, I went further with that. My landlord's a Chinese guy. He's not very chatty, but he's rich. Pocono.
Now mother and daughter
It's the most wrong guy.
will face their fears
Kiss me. Right here in front of all these people.
and find a way to find each other. Junction.
So just kind of a fun example here of how, right, we think about a Chinese American family. There are different relationships to culture, right, that the mother and daughter have, but also the challenges of navigating elements of culture and also their relationships and trying to maintain reputation within those relationships too. So an example here of Facebook. So one thing that I think is useful in examining and understanding culture is that different cultures can be defined in terms of spectrums, right? So the work of folks like Stuart Hall to understand cultures and cultural communication is work to define different cultures based on where they fit in these different categories. So we talked about high versus low context culture, right? That's how direct the message is versus how much is implied. I've made a couple mentions to this idea of individualism versus collectivism, right? Individualism refers to a group or culture in which there's a focus on things like success and personal achievement, right? So oftentimes there's the use of I and me framing. I got this promotion, I got this new job, right? There is a lot more emphasis placed on doing well or pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. Whereas in a more collectivist culture, there is generally a focus more on the achievements of the group. One example to think about is a comparison of advertisements. So if you look at advertisements that are marketed to an audience in countries like the United States and a lot of Western Europe, the imagery that's used is really different compared to other countries. For instance, there was a company that was producing golf clubs and marketing those to the United States. And what does it do? Well, it's got a picture of a man who's like, doing that fist pose because he got he sunk a really difficult putt, right? He did it and he got the ball in the hole. But in a country like China, the ad was very different. And the ad actually featured a group of people who were like cheering and celebrating together on the green. So sometimes the way an ad is marketed is a little different depending on culture. I'm a big fan of video games. If you look at video games, sometimes they're box art, and the way that they're marketed is really different across cultures too. One kind of silly example of this is if you're familiar with the Kirby video game series, right? He's the little pink puffball. Oftentimes in countries like Japan and China, right, he has this kind of normal or happy look. But sometimes when they have box art for the United States, he has these like furrowed brows and looks angry because they're trying to market him as being tougher in the United States. So it's interesting to see how cultures might be marketed differently in advertising. Masculinity and femininity, right? So I think that, there's been a lot of critique and pushback against sort of defining the spectrum in this way. This is the way that this kind of spectrum might be seen as limiting. In the context of this class, in the context of defining culture, right, what this spectrum means is to what degree work is kind of distributed or allocated on the basis of gender, right? So a culture that would be ranking higher on a masculinity end generally is one that has a greater distribution of work and tasks on the basis of gender, right? So a lot of cultures that might delegate specific tasks or responsibility to gender. Whereas on the end of femininity, there is generally a more egalitarian focus in which there is greater overlap or in terms of the types of tasks that are done between members of that culture, right? So a little bit different than how we might be thinking about gender in other contexts. It means kind of how responsibilities are defined within a culture. There's also this notion of low versus high uncertainty avoidance. So uncertainty avoidance is the degree to which we choose to expose ourselves to new information or new experiences, right? Again, to go back to the MCU, if you're familiar with Black Panther and all of that, right? The whole premise of the fictional world of Wakanda is that it's cloaked, right? And it is hidden from the outside world, and that the outside world didn't even know that it existed for the longest time. That would be pretty high uncertainty avoidance. It would be a population that doesn't necessarily want to engage with people or groups. Low uncertainty avoidance generally involves cultures that are more willing to accept and engage with new information and try new things. So there's also the use of time orientation, right? Long versus short time orientation. So different cultures see time in very different ways, right? If you go to London, right? Generally speaking, you're walking down the streets and you see a lot of people who are in a hurry. New York City's the same way, right? There's generally focus on punctuality, on getting some to place on time. So there is a longer time orientation, planning things out. Short-term orientation is generally a lot more spontaneous, right? There's a focus on the immediate kind of joy or pleasure or things that groups do, and less of a focus on planning out in a longer term events. And then the idea of indulgence versus restraint, right? We see this a lot in the context of religion or spirituality. A culture that would rank highly on restraint, be a culture in which many of its practices and behaviors are regulated, right? Or there's a focus on doing a set of behaviors or avoiding things that would be considered to be disrespectful or sinful, right? Countries that rank higher on indulgence are countries that, you know, their practices might be a little bit more hedonistic and focused on individual pleasure and doing what feels good, even if it doesn't necessarily align with a set of values or beliefs. So these spectrums help us to define and place cultures and how cultures might communicate. There's also the idea here of cultural intelligence, right? So cultural intelligence refers to the idea that somebody can function effectively and have a vocabulary for understanding cultural diversity and issues that impact members of different cultures. So cultural intelligence can be divided into 4 different parts, right? Think about cogs, again, going back to cogs in our heads, right? Cogs in a machine. Well, cognitive is having the knowledge about other cultures, creating a vocabulary. Again, a lot of world leaders, presidents, regardless of party, right? Will have a lot of snafus where they are using like a gesture, like a symbol that's considered obscene to a culture, right? Or they are shaking the hand or touching, right? So the former German Chancellor, Angela Merkel, right? There was a very strong cultural attitude where you're not supposed to touch, right? But you had political leaders who would like tap her on the shoulder. So that'd be an example of lacking cognitive knowledge of culture. Motivational, right, is the degree to which you want to understand and adapt to different cultures. So a good example of this is maybe you're studying abroad and participating in another country. Maybe you're using an app like Duolingo every day to learn the culture. That would be an example of higher motivational cultural intelligence. Metacognitive, right? So meta as a prefix means above. If you think about something like Facebook Meta, right, it is meant to be above the world, which based on the number of people that use it, does not seem to be the case. Metacognitive is you being aware of your cognition, right? Thinking about your interactions with other people and how you can be more sensitive or thoughtful to the needs of others. Wow, I realized that I shouldn't have been the one to eat first. I'm going to work on that and make sure I'm not doing that next time. And then behavioral, right, is making choices, engaging in action or communication that we see as consistent with the needs of other cultures. So behavioral cognition or behavioral cultural intelligence means that what we're doing is a reflection of what we know and understand about how to engage with other cultures effectively. So I want to present a scenario here in which I'm going to have us go into 4 different groups. And I'd like each group to focus on how this measure of cultural intelligence could be used to help Brendan with navigating his trip abroad. So Brendan wants to study abroad in Spain, but he's worried about his ability to fit in and understand an entirely different population. So using the one of the four that you're assigned, right? I want you to think about how this factor of cultural intelligence could help Brendan in engaging with this new culture and group of people. So let's do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 on cognitive. Do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 on motivational. Do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 on metacognitive. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 on behavioral. So take some time to meet with your group. Have one person write or type on this, and take some time to talk about and figure out how Brendan could use this type of cultural intelligence to navigate his trip abroad. Yeah. Show this again real quick for people. Looks like groups are about wrapped up here. Anybody who'd like some more time? Okay. So let's talk about this. Let's have one person from each group share. So starting with cognitive, how can he use cognitive cultural intelligence to navigate this trip?
We said in cognitive, you can use background research.
Mhm.
Getting in touch with others in the area
Sure.
and being generally respectful to the culture of people at the meeting. And having a willingness to accept and learn their culture.
So accepting, learning, pursuing that knowledge, right? Really good points here, Tucker. How about motivational?
We haven't just said that since, we have like motivation to be and desire to engage in like the culture that we might go out and experience like the culture more and go to events that are culturally friendly. And that would honestly make it good and know because he like wants to.
So yeah, thanks, Emma. I think being able to put yourself out there is a good example of motivational, right? So when we went on a trip to Paris for a conference, we were like, well, let's go to the middle of town. That way we were forced to engage with other people, right? Versus shutting yourself in. How about metacognitive?
We just said being aware of one's actions, how they impact their own culture. So like, thinking how they do their thing, what are the norms, and all
So what's one way that pregnancy do that?
that. Read books.
Right, so reading a book or maybe checking in with a member of the group to see like maybe there's somebody who's bilingual. Am I sounding right? Am I doing anything wrong? You know, so that would be a way of just making sure you there. And then behavioral.
And then, it'll help them know how to practice.
Yeah, so maybe learning some phrases and practices, right? Behavior being really focused on action. So yeah, that's a good point that gets at some of these elements here. So to wrap up for today, we talked about some of these spectrums that define cultures, elements of face work, and navigating these cultural needs. We'll be exploring more of these ideas on Friday and doing a fun little activity that looks into those a bit more. So please pass forward or email your group work for today with your names on it. Have a great rest of your morning, and I will see you on Friday. If you did the anonymous feedback by hand, I will also collect that from you.